So in this video, we're going to be discussing sexual assault, which we realize can be an uncomfortable topic. In fact, we're going to be using some fairly straightforward terms, and we're not doing that just for shock value, to understand kind of why.
And we want to make sure everybody's on the same page as to the terms that we're using and what that really means.
So we're going to be using just straightforward terms. And it is worth noting that in this culture, I think generally speaking, we are fairly explicit sometimes about how we talk about sex, although not how we talk about sexual assault. There's still sort of people holding back on that one. So, but we will be using some anatomical terms, kind of the terms that you might use with a doctor.
And as we go forward, we're talking about sexual assault, what we mean just in a general definition, and we'll get a little bit more in depth later. But we're really talking about any kind of sexualized contact that one person who's involved does not want.
Exactly.
It's something that they're not comfortable with, they're not okay with what happens.
Mm-hmm. And really, in different states, in different areas of this country where you are, the laws will kind of call those different things. But keep in mind, no matter what the law calls it, the acts themselves are still illegal, morally wrong, and just generally accepted to be unacceptable.
Particularly in this country. You may find that some of the things that we talk about might be considered acceptable in other places, but we want to be very clear as to what in this country is okay or is not okay.
Absolutely.
And we find that it's also very important to talk about. This is something that oftentimes isn't talked about because of embarrassment or people feeling ashamed about what's happened. But the reality is it happens fairly often and not everyone's talking.
Absolutely. Generally speaking, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men will be sexually assaulted. And so again, this is something that's happening fairly often. And we want to be sure that that we are talking in an open way, because this has a big impact on people's lives.
And these are things that could have happened at any point in that person's life. You know, when we say 1 in 3 and 1 in 5, we're talking about something that's happened over the span of their lifetime. So it may have happened years ago, or it may have happened sometime recently, and so it might have happened even in a different place than what we're at.
Absolutely. And there are certainly ways that people react fairly in the immediacy, in a short-term way, and then there are longer-term effects. So even if something happened when they were a younger child, it may be quite a bit later, they may be an adult with children of their own and are still dealing with some of the after effects of that. It is important to note that there is no wrong way to deal with this, and no one way that everyone deals with these things. Particularly, depending on the situation, they may not feel comfortable being able to express how they're feeling. If they are really trying to just sort of survive a situation, it may be a little while before they're able to access those feelings. So you may have somebody who's crying or who's very angry, or you might have someone who really isn't showing very much emotion at all.
And that, as you mentioned, really does depend on the person. But we find it's really important to talk about, because no matter what their initial response might be, if there's not any talking about these things and there's not some way to really release some of those feelings and those effects, it can lead to some true long-term issues that can be very important.
Absolutely. And some of those long-term issues might be with their physical health, having to do with their blood pressure or the way that their body is just reacting to the world. They might be more susceptible to diseases. But then there's also their emotional health, depression, or problems with how they see themselves or feeling very bad about themselves. Issues within relationships, which might be intimate relationships or marriages, or it might just be the relationship that they have with family or with other people. Maybe they just have a very hard time trusting people.
And those long-term effects sound pretty grim, but the reality is that if a sexual assault happened to somebody, it doesn't mean that they are condemned to a life alone or unhappy or rejected by society, or even as someone who is unworthy or unable to have future relationships.
Absolutely. And again, if 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men have gone through something like this, we all know these people. And, those people aren't, as you say, all walking around just very broken people. There may be times that there are what we call triggers that bring up certain feelings. Those might be a smell or a time of year, a song on the radio, even sometimes a certain color or pattern that makes people suddenly feel like they're back in that moment. And that might be a hard time for them to get through, but they do get through it then.
And it's still not seen as a reflection on their family or their spouse or anyone if it's having a hard time getting through those moments, or if it has happened. It's just simply, this is something that they may have to go through and deal with, but then can move on from.
Really, like any trauma or any big grief that happens. I think we all have had experiences with grief of one kind or another, and some people that you see are trying to take care of everybody. Some people are just very much in their feelings. Other people are just trying to keep busy or kind of make other people feel more comfortable. We all react to these things differently, and a lot of how we react to them has to do sometimes with the other things we've gone through. So again, very individual. When someone has been sexually assaulted, they have options, and that's important to know. If something has happened recently, and presumably in this country, they could certainly contact the police. It is safe to talk to the police, to talk to authorities in this country. That doesn't mark you as vulnerable for further abuse. And while not everyone feels comfortable talking to the police, which is understandable, it's not unsafe to speak to them.
And it's also important that we note that we need to talk about this topic. If the person isn't reporting to the police, it's still something that needs to be talked to or talked about, because then people can get help even outside of the police. And if it's something that hasn't happened recently, the police might not even be an option any longer, but that doesn't mean that the effects will go away. It's something that someone can still talk about, and there are lots of resources to look for.
Absolutely.
In everyone's community, there are places they can go to, generally considered a sexual assault center.
Or sometimes called a rape crisis center.
Or they may even look for somebody more close to home, someone who is familiar to them, such as someone within their religion or religious practice. It might be a friend or a family member, but it's still someone to talk to and go through this.
Yeah. I think whenever we're able to talk about those issues that come up, which are individual for each person, although, as we said, there's some things that kind of are common, but whenever we're able to talk through those things, we are in a better place, a more resilient place, to be able to handle our lives, and that's always a positive thing. A lot of times we notice that we have ideas that come up that are sort of put on us from society. So sometimes we call that a stigma, or something that society or the people generally believe about that. While we do have some of those here, we have tried to make it clear what are things in our society that people sometimes think and what are not things sometimes people think. So it is not something that people worry that, oh, well, if someone has been sexually assaulted, then they are no longer eligible for relationships, or that they need to be divorced, or anything like that. I notice that sometimes people who have not been in that situation, they'll say, oh, if that happened to me, this is what I would do. I would fight that person. I would do this, that, or the other thing. And really, until you're in that moment, you don't know how you'll react. What we know is that there's no one right way to react. We know that people often kind of imagine themselves as fighting, but usually kind of shut down or freeze.
And sometimes people flee. They run from that situation, leave the situation itself. They may not literally run, but they may be getting themselves out of it. But the bigger reaction does tend to be that they freeze or shut down.
Sometimes that's because they're trying to protect someone else that they're with, especially a young child. It might be that they're feeling threatened physically, and they're concerned if they do something else that they might be hurt worse. And sometimes that means that it's just a matter of not really knowing what your options are at that moment. That's one of the things about trauma, is it takes away a lot of your choices. So that when you're not in trauma and you're not in that crisis, you can think of all kinds of options, but when you're in that, it's not how your brain works.
And all of those different ways people judge and what they think you should do or shouldn't do, they all affect people differently. So it's not something that when something happens, one person's thinking, oh, I should have done this, and another person might be thinking something entirely different. All that really matters is that you made it through.
Absolutely. And the important part is, when you've made it through, you can work on some of those feelings. So whether someone had to give in or accommodate that person and that sexual assault in order to survive or in order to protect others, that does not mean that they have done anything to deserve that. Nobody deserves to be sexually assaulted. We've said this, but it does not impact someone's ability to get married. And in our culture, it is not seen as the same as adultery or cheating on a spouse. It's not grounds for divorce if someone's been sexually assaulted. The things that people do to you, that's not your fault.
Not your choice and not your fault.
Exactly.
So as we mentioned earlier, we gave a general definition for sexual assault. We wanted to clarify that even a little bit further.
Right, because when we are mentioning sexual assault and rape, we mean that to be really, as we said, any kind of sexualized contact where one of the people involved is not okay with what's happening.
Yeah, they're typically meaning it to be a male penetration of a female, and oftentimes with force. When we're defining sexual assault, we're going with a much more broad definition, and the FBI has truly put out a more universal definition that encompasses the realities of sexual assault.
Which is definitely a good thing for us to point out. As far as the FBI is concerned, they're talking about any sort of penetration of a person, male or female, whether that is oral, anal, or vaginal, and being penetrated by a penis, fingers, an object, or anything.
And again, it can be male or female. So when we're talking about sexual assault, we're not just categorizing one gender or another. This is something that can happen to anyone. And they've taken out the word force. So
Absolutely.
we no longer require that somebody is forcefully doing this or doing, holding them down or doing against their will in the respect of
Physically restraining.
Physical, yeah.
Because all of this is against someone's will, meaning against what they want. Sometimes it is a very physical force that might result in injury, but a lot of times it's not. A lot of times it's more the just not listening to what somebody wants, and especially if, as we said, someone is sort of shutting down or sort of just freezing up, it's not the same sort of force that's being used. In fact, I think probably now is a good time to sort of have a little check-in here. You may be feeling a little uncomfortable as we're talking about these things, particularly some of our terms. Please understand, there is a difference between sex and sexual assault.
It's important to be understanding and aware of what we're talking about, and that can be very uncomfortable and embarrassing. But when it starts to feel like it's something that we did wrong or something that we should or shouldn't have known about, that's not the situation at all.
Absolutely.
This is something that someone else does against a person, not something that a person has done to cause to themselves.
Exactly. It's a decision that the person who committed that has made. And usually it doesn't matter what the person who experienced that thinks, decides, any of that. Their choice is taken completely away. It's all the other person who's acting on them. They're the only one who is essentially having a choice in the matter.
And we do tend to use these language and these words to help not make people feel more uncomfortable, but to help prepare them for if this should happen and you do report it to the police, it's important to know that they may use the same language as they're asking questions, as they're doing their investigation, or even if you go to the hospital or the doctor's office just to be checked out and to be safe, they're going to use the same language too. It's just those medical terms that can help them to understand and really help you understand what has happened.
Exactly. We also should say that there are a lot of reasons why someone might go to the doctor, even if they're not planning on reporting this to the police, but just to be sure that physically they're okay, that there might not be any diseases or injuries or any long-term physical impact to their body because of what happened. And we should feel comfortable being able to speak with our doctors, male or female, about the things that have happened to us in the past.
Now, in the United States, when we're looking at sexual assault, one of the reasons that, unfortunately, it is such a high prevalence is that it's not a stranger jumping out of the bushes doing this. It's someone often that we know and that we may have been familiar with already.
In fact, 9 out of 10 times, that is really what the situation is. It might be someone who is a family member or a friend, even a spouse. Even within a marriage, people are not allowed to force the other person to have sex if they're not comfortable with it. If both people aren't okay with having sex at that moment, then it's not allowed to take place. And if it does, that's illegal. That's, against people's morals, and it's just not acceptable. And as we said, that really anyone could, male or female, have this happen to them, but also anyone, male or female, could be the one doing this.
And they may be doing this with power too, and power control situations where it might be someone who is taking advantage of that power. We mentioned it might be someone you know, it could be someone like a coach or a leader or a boss even, who is using this to their advantage.
Yeah. It might even be someone who has control over your safety in other ways, and so is exploiting that to say, well, I want you to do these things for me, and you have to because I control whether or not you are in this area.
Right.
So
even when that happens, if a person says yes to it, it's not really consenting. It's that sexual assault because they're using that to their advantage.
yeah, the other person is using that power difference against them, and so that the person who is saying yes doesn't really have a free choice.
Right. And we've created another video that helps to explain some of that too, that really references those personal boundaries and where consent may end or start.
And consent just meaning permission. Consent being something that you're fully cognizant, you're aware of your surroundings, you're aware of what is happening, and you're agreeing to that. We should also mention that in this country, it's fairly frequent that people will either use alcohol to lower someone's inhibitions, or will take advantage of someone who's been drinking to not necessarily understand their surroundings or the implications of their choices.
And if that person's under the influence of alcohol, what happens to them, again, is not their fault. It's simply the other person taking that to their advantage and using that situation.
And we should mention that this is some of where that self-blame comes in. Because people will say things like, well, had I not been drinking, this wouldn't have happened. Really, it's okay to have those feelings, and that's why we want to work through those, but that just doesn't mean that someone's allowed to take advantage of us. When we are in vulnerable states, that doesn't mean that it's just a free-for-all and, well, you shouldn't have been vulnerable in the first place. That is not how things work. Somebody who is taking advantage of us is in the wrong. We would like to really stress that if any of these things have happened to you, whether recently, a long time ago, in this country or another, no matter where it was, no matter when it was, and no matter who it was, it's always okay to reach out. We have local resources, every place has them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can look for resources in your home, in your hometown, in your area, in your state. There are some that stretch even nationally, so there are lots of places to go and talk to about this.
Mm-hmm. So we want to thank you for bearing with us as in what probably could have been an uncomfortable conversation, but an important one to have. Nobody deserves to be treated this way.